So hello everyone, welcome to Frontend United Athens. My name is, as Mathieu said, Zaharenia Atzitzikaki, which, let's face it, even by Greek standards, it's a pretty ridiculous name. For the non-Greeks among us, it can be loosely translated to something like sugar, the condiment, and cicada, the insect. And I was going to make a stripper name joke out of it, but people told me it would be inappropriate, so I won. So I consider myself to be a 50% designer, 50% developer hybrid. I equally enjoy my time creating mockups in Sketch and implementing them in HTML, CSS, or SAS. Even though nowadays I'm more of a 100% designer because I lead the product design team at Workable. Workable is an ATS, an applicant tracking system that we like to say people actually like to use. So I wanted to do this talk. When I submitted it back in January, I knew that I wanted to do this talk, wanted to talk about my experience. What I didn't know at the time was that I was going to give this talk in front of Jonathan Snook of Smack's fame. Yay, go me. I was going to talk about scaling CSS in front of Jonathan Snook. So yeah. Anyway, what should you expect? I'm a pretty practical person, so I really like the bleeding edge stuff that Leah presented, right? I really like that. But I also like the talks that are more practical, that they provide practical solutions, like a place to start. So this is what we're going to do today. I'm going to give you, probably, a practical guide for scaling CSS when you're short on resources, when you're short on time and short on people. Let's imagine you have like an aging code base that was put together under strict deadlines and tons of stress. And you have to refactor it. You have to continue work on the features for your product. And then you also have to onboard new team members to that code base. So it's tough, right? You have to do all this without pausing for breath. It's something like driving a bicycle downhill and while also trying to change the bicycle chain. But it can be done, and I'll show you how. So I think that CSS is failing us a bit. CSS is failing us a bit nowadays. You all know it, it's simple. It tends to look like a Zen garden. Everything is really simple at first, but it can be easily made into a jungle. It only takes a very strict deadline to find your CSS code full of hacks, full of very, very long selectors that make you scratch your head afterwards. So the truth is that CSS was not made exactly for this. It's a very elegant solution that's solving problems in a very elegant way. But nowadays, the problems that CSS is facing are far from simple. So what can be problematic about CSS in scale? Since everything is basically a global variable, there is no scope, every class, every ID, every attribute, you can find yourself shaking your fist at the cascade really often. And then another particularly tricky thing is source order, especially if you're using preprocessors. You never know exactly what overrides what. Not to mention the vast amounts of repetition that even a relatively complex CSS system requires. So, which of you have used preprocessors or are using preprocessors? That's a good percentage. Let me preface the talk by saying that preprocessors are really an essential part of this guide. If you're not familiar with them, you're in for a treat, I think. They're solving many, many annoyances that we have with CSS right now, as it is right now. So, and it's not, you know, the entrance point is quite low because especially if you go with SAS, the CSS syntax, every valid CSS file is basically a valid SCSS file. So yeah, you can start using them today. I really liked this recent quote by Mika Goldbold. He says that writing the correct CSS once is pretty easy. The hard part is trying to make that CSS code work in all situations and for all people. So let's set some ground rules first. What I like to do in this kind of situation is envisioning exactly how the perfect CSS framework will be, the perfect solution, and then just try to reverse engineer my way back from it. So everything in our perfect CSS framework should be reusable. There are no one-off styles, right? We have to assume that everything is going to be reused down the line, so no IDs. Also, our CSS should be easily extensible. That means that it will be easy to add or remove styles from our code without feeling too anxious about it. I think I made up this word. Documentability is also a really important issue. Our CSS code should be easy to document. And I think I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but when we're going to talk about modules, components, a good test to test if a module is well-defined is try to actually document it. Even if you don't have any kind of documentation solution in place, try to document it just by using a CSS comment. If you can't document the different states, it probably needs to be refactored. And the last thing is, we should avoid the specificity word. So our CSS should be kept as flat as possible to avoid piling up important declarations just to make things work. So now that we know what to fight for, let's create the battle plan. I really like this big. I found that when you're short on resources, there are 5 loose steps that you can follow to tackle an old code base. These are not exactly serial, so you don't have to actually finish one step to go to the other. And some of them are also ongoing objectives, so they're not steps per se. So our first step is actually prepare for refactoring. Set down some refactoring rules. Decide what works in our code base, what doesn't, what can be omitted, and what can be simplified. The second step is creating a file structure. We have to establish that to follow throughout the project to work better. One of the best things I think that preprocessors brought to CSS is the ability to have partials, small, flexible files that can be combined into one style sheet. The third step is naming. Naming is ridiculously hard. It's supposed to be one of the hardest problems in tech, I think, with caching. So it is difficult, especially in complex CSS systems. Is it a drop-down or an option list? Is it a field or a control? So we have to set up some basic naming rules, or even use one of the established naming conventions to save us a lot of time. Then we have the biggest and one of the most important steps, which is modularization, creating the basic building blocks of our framework. So it's a bit difficult to decide what's a module and what's not, and how do modules interact with each other while also being autonomous and self-contained. The whole process should be thoroughly documented to make sense to others and to yourself, like in 6 months. We have to write down and keep track of our coding style guidelines and create maybe a style guide that we can use to communicate our framework to other members of your team. So let's go through the steps in detail. Refactoring, the first step. Refactoring is not exactly a novel idea. It's a staple of every developer's workload, and it's the only way to keep a code base sane and adaptable. Developers seem to love refactoring because you get that new, fresh bed sheets kind of feeling. Who doesn't love refactoring? I dare you. 1. Wow. Meet me later. I want to discuss that. So it's important, while refactoring, it's important to follow some basic rules, because this step, refactoring, can be easily made into a huge dark hole that will devour all your resources and all your time. So Basically, there are two approaches into refactoring. You can either, okay, discuss it with your team, stop, do a feature freeze, stop any kind of work, and just dedicate an amount of time and resources to it till it's finished. Or you can do it the hard way, as I said earlier. You can do it while you're also working on feature work. So you have to do it in iterations. You don't have the time to actually sit and do it in one go. To be honest, in all my 12 years of experience in this work, no company ever came to me and said, okay, you can have 6 months. We'll do a feature freeze for 6 months, and you can rewrite the CSS code base. No company ever. So, yeah. Another problem while refactoring is convincing the stakeholders. We do face that a lot. It's important to understand that refactoring for non-developers, it's kind of a black box. They don't understand what's in it. So hopefully it does not impact the project a bit because it doesn't cause any kind of problems. So they don't understand what's the use. Why do that? What I like to do in times like that is that I tend to ignore them. Even though they refuse, I tend to ignore them. And just refactor one small thing. Then I measure the performance or the productivity gains before and after, and I show it to them. No one can resist cold, hard math. Another thing about refactoring is that we have to test and test and test some more, just to gain the trust of the stakeholders, right? Because if you start refactoring and they don't see anything different in the product and they see things breaking, they're going to stage a revolt. So even if you don't have any kind of quality assurance procedure in place, you should, by the way, we have to test. We have to test a lot because regression errors are very common in this phase. Golden rule of refactoring is to refactor one thing only. We don't have to try and be smart and make everything perfect in one go because we will become like this cat. Have you ever fallen into that hole? I know I did. Well, it's getting late. So, not everything needs to be refactored. When we're doing a refactoring, we're not rewriting the whole code base. You have to spot what bothers you the most and fix it first. A good rule of thumb is that if it bugs you 3 times, you have to fix it. We don't have to refactor old code that's rarely ever used, or maybe code that is going to be obsolete in a few months. We don't have to chase our tails like that. You have to be okay with the fact that you're going to do about 80% of the refactoring that you want to do. So let's move to the second step. Second step is creating a file structure. So if your code base consists of a loose collection of files with random bits of CSS in it, you have to get a bit more organized than that. The first sub-step in this step is making sure that every piece of code that you have that's related in any way ends up in the same file. So maybe you have like heading styles or link styles or table styles. You can group them in a partial called typography. Same for fields, drop-downs, and radio buttons. They can all go into a forms partial. Then all these partials will be combined with a manifest file that only does the imports into a single style sheet. So after cleaning up, you'll probably be left with a collection of standalone partials that share the same characteristics. This is the time where you start collecting them in folders, depending on their complexity. I usually start with a base folder containing styles like grid, reset, and typography. Then I move to a modules folder, that's the basic building blocks, with stuff like alerts or maybe drop-downs or tabs. And then I have a folder called pages or sections or views that contain partials with view-specific styles. They are all combined into one file by the style.scss file. So you can go crazy here, right? You know atomic design, so you don't have to call them like that. You can call them atoms, and then molecules, and then organisms, and then, I don't know, robots, AI, and then amorphous nebulae. So you can go crazy here, right? You can go crazy. But I have to say that you don't have to actually choose and work with this kind of system if it doesn't work for your product. Don't feel pressured to use that just because everyone seems to use it. You only know the particularities of your project, so you only know how you should divide those. So yeah, don't just head straight for a solution just because it's there. Now, the third step is establishing a naming convention. This is where things start to get really interesting. Any complex framework can benefit by a set of naming rules, especially if there are lots of people involved. Now, you might wonder, why do I need a fancy term like a naming convention? I know how to name stuff. I can figure it out as I go. But naming conventions are useful for two main reasons. One, they help keep things consistent. So especially if large teams are involved, you know that the code that ends up in your style, or in your style.css, should look like it was written by one person only. Two, naming conventions often help in understanding better the interaction between modules just by reading the markup. So let's see an example here. Here we have a box, which has a header and a content. Just by reading the markup, we don't know if the header or the content have any kind of significance outside the box. We don't know if they're linked in any way. So what can we do here? We can, if they are connected, we can rename them like that. In this way, we can understand, just by reading the markup, that box header and box content are, in fact, parts of box, so they don't have any kind of significance outside of a box. So nowadays there are dozens of naming conventions. We have Object-Oriented CSS by Nicole Sullivan, we have SMUX by Jonathan Snook, and then we have BEM, which is getting very popular, by Yandex, which is a huge Russian company. But only your team knows the particularity of your project. So again, don't feel pressured to use something just because everyone else seems to use it. Feel free to create your own naming convention. And I have a spoiler alert for you. It will never be perfect, never. So don't feel bad about it. A naming convention is just that, it's a convention. Try your best to follow the rules. And don't feel guilty if, I don't know, maybe an aging third-party script requires the presence of some certain class names in your code. So what do? Do you fork it and just change the class names into BEM? That doesn't work. The goal here is to remove ambiguity when naming things. It's not to scratch our head over naming a box. Another cool trick that you can use when naming CSS classes is namespaces. As we said, there is no kind of scope right now in CSS, so we can use prefixes to denote the type of class that we have. So we can use something like U for utility classes, M for modules, is and has for states, maybe a JS for JavaScript hooks, or QA for quality assurance hooks. Especially the JS one was really interesting in the early days of our CSS framework because JavaScript developers tended to use hooks back then. They weren't cool. They weren't using React. So we tended to use hooks back then. And they used these hooks, our classes, our CSS classes, but we changed them all the time. So every once in a while, you could see pitchforks and fires in the office because we made things break. So just by adding a special JS prefix class, we could do things like styling the module without affecting the actual JavaScript code. And now that we have talked about how we should avoid piling up important declarations, right? But now is the point where important becomes important again. Let's see what I did here. So you can use important in one-trick pony helper classes like this. Chances are that if you put these classes in your, like a class like hide, that's my favorite example, if you put a class like hide in your markup, you really want that widget to be hidden. So it's fine to use important here, or else it will be overridden by another longer selector, which has more specificity. So the fourth step is creating your modules, modularization. This is, as I said, one of the most important and longest ones. We have to start thinking differently. Scalability brings a paradigm shift to the way we're thinking about styling, coding, websites. We have to stop thinking about pages and views, and we have to start thinking in terms of modules. Views is kind of an ancient thing that came over from graphic design. To make an extensible CSS system, though, we have to start thinking in modules. So modules are supposed to be self-contained, reusable widgets that can be put together in various ways to create views. So, as I said, they should be self-contained, they should be oblivious of their surroundings, they should not make any assumptions about where they will be used. And they should also be simple and flexible. This is not the place where we should be clever and try to do many things at one time. They should do one thing and one thing only. So how does that change the way we code? I'll give you a simple example. Let's say you have an article page, and in the sidebar you have these two boxes. As you can see, they both share the same heading style, so details and share is styled exactly the same. They have the same typography. One of them contains details about the article, so the author and then the publication date and then tags. And the other contains a list of social services where you can share this article to. So one way to code this could be like this. Use the H5 for the heading, put there the uppercase and the color, then code the first box as details, and code the second box as side share. What's problematic about this is that we're using the class name to suggest the kind of content that the module has. And especially in SideShare, we also dictate where it should be used. That means that if we got this share box and we moved it elsewhere, this class name will be obsolete, and we have to refactor. And that's not really nice. So one way we could do that is name them both boxes. Use a box class, put the common styles there, and then create a modifier class of important to add the symbol border around it, because it seems like it's more important. Another thing is that instead of using H5, which is quite generic, we should use something like box header, which is an element of box that has all the styles for the headings. So my advice is that class names should not describe content or position in scalable CSS systems. What do we gain with that? When done correctly, modularization has many benefits. So we can put together new views just by adding scaffolding with grid classes and then adding modules in the allocated space. This dramatically reduces the amount of code needed to create a new feature, and it's much faster as well. Using modules, you can focus on the real challenges of the design and stop thinking about duplicating and overriding code again and again. This is also the place where your naming convention will shine, or maybe crash and burn. Different parts of the module, as we saw, should be named in a way that denotes the relationship between them. Styles should also be applied in the flattest way possible to avoid the specificity wars, as we said at first. We're going to the fifth step, the last piece of the puzzle. And this is one of the steps that you can spend virtually ages in. And that's documenting your code base and making sure that future contributions are consistent with your current coding style. As your code base is a living organism, don't expect to dedicate a chunk of time to documentation and just be done with it. you have to choose a documentation method that will be updated as your code expands and grows. So it's best to find a solution that takes care of much of the groundwork for you. Living style guides are perfect for that. They're automated systems that work with your code base and automatically generate browsable documentation pages based on documentation you write yourself in your CSS. There are tons of great tools out there. There's also a website that's dedicated to style guides that has tons of write-ups of articles and tools. So you can find one solution for your stack, I'm sure of it. What we actually tested out and really liked, it's been a while, but we still like it, is Hologram by Trulia. Hologram is one of the less opinionated solutions, but for that, it takes a bit of time to actually set it up and make it work. But then you have the chance to write comments like that, which, as you can see, is like a SAS comment with a bit of markdown thrown in. You can write comments like that, and they automatically get translated to documentation like this, which is pretty good. Now, another thing that we should do is give the team, work with the team, and create a set of coding guidelines to ensure that all future code written will be consistent with your coding style. You can find CSS guidelines in this website by Harry Roberts and SAS guidelines in this website by Hugo Girondel. And they have written about everything exhaustively. You don't have to follow all of those advice, to the point, but it's a good thing to go through these websites, see what applies and doesn't apply to your code base, to your product, and document a set of rules for your coding style. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be a wiki page in GitHub. It can even be a Google document, but you have to write them down so you can easily share them with your team. Another thing is that linting helps to that a lot. As your CSS grows and evolves, it has become an essential part of the workflow, I think. The goal, as we said earlier, is to have a code base that can be read like written by one person. So linting can help you keep your code base consistent. This is what linting rules look like. So the goal here is to work with your team and come up with a set of rules that should be applied when writing CSS. So don't be afraid to revisit the rules row. When we first started using linting in Workable, we had a rule that said that the maximum nesting depth in SAS should be 3, because it's a rule. People tend to say that. But then we realized that at some points, actually refactoring the depth to go from 4 to 3 would make the code unreadable. So we revisited that and we changed it back to 4. Don't be afraid to do that. Linting can be done in any kind of situation, even if you're a command line aficionado, or if you like using your text editors like code here, or maybe even automated while pushing things in GitHub. You can find a linting solution for every workflow. So let's recap a bit. Let's go over the steps. This is a battle plan you can apply right now to clean up and organize your CSS code base, making it scalable and helping your team members during the process. First step, prepare for refactoring. Set up some ground rules and decide what should be refactored and what not. Second step, create a basic file structure so that you can easily add new code or remove code without worrying too much about where to put it. Third step is choosing a naming convention so that you can keep things consistent down the line. Fourth step, creating modules, create the basic building blocks of your CSS framework. And fifth step is documentation and maintenance, adding lead, documenting your coding style, and maybe creating a style guide. So what I wanted to close with is that the front-end landscape changes so dramatically over the years. heck, even for the past few months. Maybe this talk will be obsolete by the end of 2017, I don't know. What will the future hold for complex CSS system? Maybe we write all our CSS in CSS components, so scoping won't be an issue. Or maybe JavaScript, God forbid, will replace CSS in delivering styles to the browser. The thing is that we can't wait for that golden moment to come, for the perfect solution to come in our way. So I would suggest keeping this set of rules nearby when coding, trying to do one thing at a time, and try not to beat yourself up too much over the quality of your code base, because after all, I think we're all here for the long run. So thank you. Questions? Yes.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you. I have the following question about naming conventions. We can choose a naming convention and use our as a rule set, as you said. But what happens in a real-life example, so to speak, when we have our CMS that outputs its own classes, then we use some libraries that output their own classes as well, and we have a mix of naming conventions probably. How do you approach the situation?
Okay. So I admit I'm not familiar with this particular kind of situation because I don't work with CMS, but if you're working with CMS, this part, the whole part that you explained, that it puts out like weird class names, this is part of your technical constraints. So this is part of the problems that you should discuss with your team to come up with a naming convention. If you're in this place, you don't have to use BEM. You don't have to go around changing, I don't know, Drupal widgets and maybe tweak the code that they're putting out. You don't have to use that. So try to make a solution that works best for that case. Don't be afraid to do that. So you don't, it's not that you will be uncool if you don't use BEM.
Just one last thing is that, so is it all right to mix different name conventions in a way or?
Yes, definitely. Sorry if I interrupted you. Definitely. I think it's one of the things that only we developers check. So this is done just so it can be easily documented and you can easily onboard other people in your code, right? So it's done for us. In the long scheme of things, it doesn't do any kind of, it's not bad if you mix conventions. But if you have a system and you say, okay, I'm mixing this kind of conventions because this and this and this with Drupal module output a different kind of code. If you document that, you're all right.
Thank you very much.
Don't beat yourself up too much about it.
Thanks, Matthew. What do you do in terms of having the same component in two separate places if you don't use, say, .side-share for your share widget, but you want that share widget in your sidebar and you also want it in your footer, or you got a search block in your header and you got a search block after your main content body, let's say. So you want two different styles for the same component, depending on where they are placed on the page.
So I don't think I understand the question. Just a moment, so we can see the example. So we have this, right?
Yeah, so you got the share widget there, and you got a class called
box.
.box.
Yeah.
So earlier you said don't use .share-sidebar.
Yeah.
But you want that share widget in two separate places. So you want it in your sidebar looking like that, but you also want it in your footer, for example.
Okay.
With display inline rather than display block for each link. So you got the exact same component, but in two separate places. What's the naming convention?
There are two things about it. One, as we said, the module should be oblivious of its surroundings. So this widget here should not have a set width, right? It should be always 100% width. So it can fill every place that it's put into. But if you wanted another style, so maybe an horizontal style or something like that, I would probably keep box as it is and add a modifier class to the list. So you have a UL here, right? A basic UL. But if I wanted to show it horizontally or with a different style, I will use something like UL class inline, something like that. So you have to check at the content of your module, the stuff you put in it, and create small modules. You don't have to, so that this class, if we add an inline class, you can use it elsewhere as well. You don't have to create a box, a modifier box dash dash inline just to make this work. Did that make sense? Okay.
Okay. Hi, Zaharenia, and
Hi.
thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask you for your opinion concerning the steps that you suggest. In case you and your developer teams reach at a time that you need to change or adopt a naming convention, so you have to pass from all those steps, from refactoring code, changing probably the file structure, and etc. What would you do? What
So
if those steps that you suggested
these are,
need to do something more? Or
so you're saying that what should we do if we can't change our naming convention?
no, if you need to change it.
You change it.
Yeah.
Am I missing something
if you
here?
already, if the backend developers use a different naming convention,
Yeah.
or even if
Okay,
they don't use one.
If they don't use a naming convention, you have to sit with them and come up with a set of naming rules so that everyone is on the same page. If they use a naming convention, first of all, you're lucky if your backend developers do that. Second, if the code written is enough that doesn't justify the cost of refactoring it, I'm sorry, but you lose. You have to follow the naming convention that your backend developers follow, okay? So you have to keep sight of the objective here. The objective is to be one, flexible while coding, two, quick. This is all for performance. This is all for productivity. So we shouldn't chase our tails and refactor everything just because we don't like a particular developer and we don't like the kind of naming convention he uses, right? Yeah, that's a good point, actually. But sometimes backend developers are, ambitious like that. Yes.
Okay. Let's say that we are following all the guidelines that you proposed, and they are all in the right direction. Have you any idea about how to reduce your code base in terms of unused CSS? Let's say that we have a code base of CSS, large CSS, but we need to set up all of these guidelines and follow these directions. But of course, we may have a lot of unused CSS because, iterations, new designs, redesigns, a lot of CSS are there, but they're not used. Except that, other than the coverage tool, developer tools that we may all know, are you aware of any tools, automated tools?
Yeah, I think there are both command line tools and maybe Chrome extensions that do this kind of work. They analyze your style sheet and they come up with unused selectors. This can work well or not that well. But you have to understand that in scalable systems, sometimes you write CSS just to be able to use it later. So the concept of unused CSS is a bit weird. So you won't maybe use a class name like margin top or maybe text align center, text center, because at that point in time you don't use it. It's unused, but you need it to to become scalable. So it's a weird concept, but there are tools. If you want, I can show you later. There are tools that you can use to just see what's used and what's not.
Thank you.
People have a lot of questions. Aren't you hungry?
Thank you. May I have the question or somebody else?
Where are you?
Okay. Are you in favor, it's really simple, are you in favor of creating new classes or to have more complex selectors in order not to change the developer's code?
It kind of depends.
If
I'm
we-
sure you're talking about a very specific case right now. You have a very specific case in mind, right?
No. If it is possible to show some code in the presentation
Yeah.
to see what I mean.
You want me to dictate and I'll write?
I think the code with the boxes.
With the boxes, right? So, this one.
Yes.
Okay. So, what's the question here? Do you want to... Let's say you have this kind of code. What do you mean?
If we have already a code of HTML code, which is have been done, and if we like to add classes or to keep it and using more complex selectors.
Yeah, I think
Let's
I got
say-
what you mean. I think
Yes,
I got what you mean.
that's a point of,
Yeah, I
I
understand.
don't know.
That's a point of discussion, right?
Yes,
You
and
had lots of fights over it.
I would like your opinion and what's your favorite.
Well, my opinion as a UI engineer is that we should avoid writing more code if the styles are already there. So I wrote this box class because I know that there is this kind of widget in 2 places, and it's probably going to be there a few more times. So the less code we write in CSS, I think it's the best. It's for the best. Because then we lose the kind of concept of modular code. We lose the kind of modules because we create modules for them to be reused. If we start creating modules that are just like that, but just a bit different, we're kind of losing the point here. So yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's a question here.
When it comes to style guides and time management, what is your opinion or experience? How much time would a developer spend on documenting the code, averagely?
Yeah, I think that it's something that to be done. We're not too good about it at Workable, by the way. I'm the first to admit that. But if we want something like this to be done, it's a lot of work, right? If we want something like this to be done, we have to dedicate like a certain amount of time weekly to that. So I don't know, we have a thing like documentation Fridays, and we, for a set amount of time on Fridays, we work on documentation. That's the only way that you can actually make progress on that. And then just, you know, share your progress and talk with your team and say that, okay, today I documented, I don't know, alerts and drop-downs and tabs. This is the only way to actually keep working on stuff, keep doing feature work, but also documenting the code that you've already written.
So averagely 20% of the work.
Yeah, whatever works for your workflow.
But you're good at what you do, and you are able to make the stakeholders give you that time, right?
Do you think? I don't know. Probably. Question? No? Thank you.